existential detectives be like, have tinfoil passport, will time travel. Dr. Joseph Riggio, thank you so much for coming back to continue our ongoing in-depth explorations. And I would like to greet you with a cognitive brain salute. I am a little bit bound up here today in the chains of linguistic narratives and bondage, but I know that you will free me in our conversation.
Very nice. I like that.
Is that a
all
promise?
kinds of implications, double entendres, and innuendo there.
At the end of our last conversation, you left a breadcrumb for us to follow up with today, and that was you tied the discussion that we had had about all trauma, whether developmental sensitizing imprints that start early in life, or the great trauma that it seems most humans endure when they switch from an intrinsic orientation to an extrinsic orientation, to the traumas that happen over the course of our lives. And you said that all of these categories of trauma affect a person in time, and therefore part of the rehabilitation process in healing any and all of these traumas has to do with time travel. As an existentialist, I am crazy for time travel. I am full of conspiracies and theories and tinfoil moments about time travel. So I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you today.
I'm all there. I mean, I think I went into trance at some point when you were sharing all of those various elements of what we're going to do. But let's go.
Well, if I can put you into trance, I am deeply honored.
Then you should feel honored.
Dr. Riggio, in true nested loop fashion, I believe that you have models within models within models within models. Would you be willing to break down the sequence of models that you've developed over the course of your storied career?
Sure. I mean, the basic mechanism, before there were any models, is the idea of modeling. And modeling is my fundamental research tool, you can call it. And this came out of my training with Roy Frazier, who we've mentioned many times, my mentor. And it came to Roy, I think, as much as from anywhere else, and maybe almost exclusively so, through working with Richard Bandler and the NLP crew. Because NLP was an idea initially of modeling. That's what NLP was based on, neuro-linguistic programming. The stuff that people are familiar with from neuro-linguistic programming, the applications of neuro-linguistic programming, came out of the modeling process. And the specific modeling process is really interesting because when we think about like how people have looked at human behavior and human nature and what it is to be human and all these deep, profound philosophical thoughts and phenomenological awarenesses and so on and so forth, even the spiritual models that we can talk about, they all look at it to a very great extent when they try to describe it in mass quantity, put it out to the public, put it into pop psychology form, as the mean, the center. Like, what is it like for the average person to be having these experiences? What's it like for the average person to want to be, an athlete? What's it like for the average person to think about things or to read or whatever it may be? It doesn't matter. The average is the thing that psychology especially, and much, much, much of sociology points to. The distinction here is that what the guys who were doing NLP, Richard Bandler and John Grinder, were doing from the very start is they were trying to find exemplars. The people who were so extraordinary, they messed up the bell curve. Like if you put them in the bell curve, it changed the curve, right?
Right.
And so that most people, when they're doing research, actually literally exclude that. And they go, this person's so far outside the norm in terms of their ability to do what they do. If we include them, we can't get a mean because now the mean is stretched so far to the right that it's no longer the mean. It's no longer really the center because they topple and they overweight the positive side of the equation. So they're ignored. The NLP modeling process was always about finding those people who would topple the model. and asking the question, why do they? Why are these people so extraordinary that they go off the charts, right? Why is it that when you look at a movie, and it's easy to see in the movies, and you see a character like Jason Bourne, that he seems to be doing these extraordinary superhuman things, and yet when you actually look at those movies, the Matt Damon ones specifically, what you find is that Jason Bourne was not doing extraordinary things. He was doing things that humans can do and are capable of, but doing them at such a high level, such an elite level of performance, they seemed superhuman. So his ability to recall, his ability to remember facts and figures, to notice things that were going in the environment, his ability to strategize and organize so that he was thinking 3, 4, 10 steps ahead of what was going to happen. These are things humans do. It's unusual, to say the least, to find them in one person, but these are very normal human experiences.
And just to reference our previous conversation, by using that example, obviously it was a fictional one, but it may be based in some truth. Many of the skills and abilities that Jason Bourne was exhibiting were also born out of trauma.
Well, for sure. I mean, if we watch the movie series, they make it very clear that the way they got him there was via trauma. They literally traumatized him to, number one, erase large portions of his previous memory of who he was, install programming, which he agreed to according to the way the movie was organized, to become more effective and to remove some of his past in some ways. And they did that through traumatic installation. So trauma, as we said in the previous conversation, is just a phenomenal learning tool. And done properly, it teaches us in one experience how to respond to the kind of stimulus that are useful to respond to in the way that trauma teaches us to respond to them. Again, if you're in an environment where loud noises mean there are shells coming down or people are firing guns at you, to learn to go low to the ground and avoid the place where it's most likely to get hurt is a really useful thing to have learned, right? So this is a really interesting thing. It's a great connection you make there, that part of the learning experience of these elite people may in fact be traumatically organized, right? Mm-hmm. And it's an away from learning. So what I mean by that is they learn what not to do to put them at risk. So when they fail, the trauma of failure teaches them how not to fail. Don't do that thing again, right? Don't not tie your shoelaces before you go on the soccer field, okay? So this is the kind of thing that it sounds trivial, but once a person stumbles over their own feet, they learn how not to stumble over their own feet. They learn where to place their feet. They learn to tie their shoes. They learn to do the things that are necessary to not have the same experiences of failure that they had the time before. At least normal people learn from their failures. There are some folks who seem to exalt in failing the same way over and over and over again. But let's make believe they're unusual.
I wouldn't know anything about that. What I was going to say, Joseph, is that the way that some of these exemplars, as you're calling them, responded to trauma is also exemplary. So even in that regard, they're affecting the mean in the bell curve.
That's absolutely true. There's a number of cases where we've seen situations after the fact where there was a traumatic event that occurred for a number of people. Mass kidnappings, terroristic attacks where multiple people, of course, were involved in this scenario. Even mass shootings and things of this nature where a lot of people were involved and the experience was clearly traumatic. What we find is that there's a group of people which immediately drop into the autonomic nervous sympathetic response of freezing. They go into almost a catatonic freeze. Now this is really useful in a way because there's this idea that I talked about, which is tonic immobility, that shuts down the system. And when you shut down the system, the memory function also gets cut off. And so there's no memory of the trauma. The problem is that trauma is also installed at a visceral somatic body-based level. And when that stimulus comes up, the body remembers to shut down. So you wind up getting shut down, without necessarily knowing why. I don't know why. When I go near a room like this, I feel so uncomfortable. It's almost like I can't move my feet anymore and walk towards it. I don't know why. Well, if we looked at their history, we could probably uncover exactly why. So that's one aspect of it. There are other people in that environment that go into flight mode. So something traumatic is happening and they immediately get into, the fire in the auditorium mode where they're trying to trample other people to get out of there. That kind of an effect, especially if literally you push someone else out of the way, or you stopped someone else from getting to safety to save yourself, often has very deep and profound psychological lingering effects. You know that you were not capable of dealing with the situation, even though you got away, even though you wound up being relatively or completely safe. There was a cost involved in the way you responded, and you know that you may not get safely away the next time. So it, again, creates these lingering psychological imprints. There's a third type of person who tends to go into fight mode. And that person who goes into fight mode is the person who seems to recover most quickly from post-traumatic stress and seems to have the least effect of post-traumatic stress to begin with. They function really well. And these are kind of the survivor mentality people. And what they do is they go, what do I need to do to get out of this situation? These are the people who move, the burning beams out of the way to get out of the fire. These are the people who find the secondary exit from the building when the person is coming through the front door and they're dangerous. These are the people who think through the situation, even if it's in panic, but are actively doing something to take care of themselves and probably others if they can. So they're not just getting themselves out of harm's way. When there are other people involved, they tend to look out for others and help them get out of harm's way as well. These people have the least lingering effects. You have a fourth group, and these are the exemplars. Somehow or another, this kind of traumatic event for them stimulates a kind of calm, a kind of serenity. And we've all heard about these people. Maybe, everybody who's listening has had this experience in one scenario or another where it's like the more things go bad, the calmer and more centered I get. It's like I actually function really well in a certain type of crisis. Now, nobody functions really well in all types of crisis. So the person who can function well when they see somebody else get injured and immediately drop into action and take care of that person and stop the bleeding and wrap the wound, and they're on the phone calling an ambulance and making sure the person gets to a healthcare facility safely, doesn't necessarily deal with being in a house fire with that kind of calm and collectedness. And the person who deals with the house fire doesn't necessarily deal with seeing somebody get hurt with the same kind of calm and collectedness. So it can be context specific, right?
I'm picturing that famous scene from Apocalypse Now.
Right.
The character was surveying, a scene of
Robert Duvall on the beach, who loved the smell of napalm in the morning that smelled like victory. Right. And the bombs are coming down, a mile away, and he's taking his boys out surfing. Right? That kind of stuff. Yeah. So there are those people who seem, the more chaotic the environment gets, literally the better they function. And we see this in people like top surgeons. It's like when things go bad, they go into hyperdrive and they perform actually in a way that's extraordinary even for them. There's people we see in other healthcare environments like critical nursing, that when a patient seems to be diving and they're about to be in a really distressed state, the critical care nurse goes into hyperdrive and performs at an extraordinary level. We see other people in other kinds of environments, again, I mentioned firefighters, have the capability of doing this, of making instantaneous decisions in high crisis, high chaotic environments and making just the right decision. Okay? And I could point out others and others and others and others, people who are professional deep divers and make decisions under high stress situations that are critical and either save their lives or the lives of other people. There are instances of school teachers who have been under great duress in a classroom situation where something's gone wrong. Somebody has threatened another student and it's gone beyond the point of normal discipline, where they have to step in and they make some critical move that changes the situation and deflates it and everybody's okay, right? So these kinds of scenarios where we have exemplary behavior are what Richard Bandler and John Grinder were looking for, the exemplars. And they were looking for it not necessarily in terms of chaotic response to trauma, but they were looking for it in terms of high performance. People who were in the military, the best marksmen. People who were in therapy, the people who could do sessions with individuals that had failed with every other therapist they've been to and create breakthrough outcomes, right? People who were mathematicians who were able to think mathematically and solve equations that in some cases had not been solved for decades or centuries. And what did these people do differently? And these were the exemplars they looked for. So I learned, as my first research methodology, exemplar modeling. And so I began to also try to pay attention to how people did extraordinary things. Because of my time with Roy and learning from him and watching him do interventions, it became very interesting to me to understand how people did exemplary things in their lives as individuals. So how are you, Alicia, particularly exemplary at being Alicia? What is it that you do that really is extraordinary? And can I lead you to a state of experience and awareness where you have a sense of yourself performing at an extraordinary level, even if it's incredibly contextually narrow, right? You knit better than anybody in your entire knitting group. And when you're knitting, you're so good at it, you never have to go back and fix a stitch, right? Now, it may seem trivial, but to the individual who experiences something like that, it's profound because they realize, oh, I'm in a different state. I experience myself differently when I'm doing that, when I'm like that. And so there's a kind of catchphrase I use all the time. Like this, what's possible for you? Meaning when you're like that, in that extraordinary, exemplary state, what is it that's possible for you? Like this, like you are now, because I've led them there, I've elicited that from them. What can you do? And the answer that I'm looking for always is anything. And that's the crux, that's the center of what I call the state of perfection. And my first model that we'll talk about is the MythoSelf model, the MythoSelf process specifically, which is designed to lead people into and then to stabilize and create a default experience of the state of perfection for them. So they literally begin operating in their lives, hopefully by their feet touching the ground in the morning as they throw their legs over the side of the bed, the experience of being in their state of perfection. And that sets the tone, that sets the ground, the baseline for everything they experience as they move through their day. And if they do that day after day after day, of course, in their life. So that's the MythoSelf process. That's, again, the crux of what I try to do. And what I've been successful at doing for decades now is leading people into and to experience life from their state of perfection. And that, in a way, generates everything else we'll talk about. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And is it all right if my exemplar skill has to do with wearing a lot of tinfoil?
Absolutely. If you wear tinfoil more extraordinarily than anyone you know, if you can minimize the amount of tinfoil you need to wear to prevent the alien invasion of your mind, that would be an exemplary example.
At the moment, I seem to be maximizing the amount of tinfoil that I'm wearing, but it is all a process, isn't it?
Right. And what happens is, actually, interestingly enough and funnily enough, it was a good segue that we stumbled upon. And that is that when I work with people, the exemplary position is always there. People are extraordinary at being themselves when they let go of the need or desire to present themselves in any way other than the way they are. And of course, most people don't think they're doing that, but life has conditioned them to do that. This is part of that trauma sensitizing imprint stuff we talked about, right? If I don't show up like this, I get rejected. So do that for 20 years and you forget who you are, right? And leading somebody back to the originating position where, again, by accident, you could say, they were just simply themselves. And in that moment in time, in that space that they were in, it just worked. And that recollection of, oh my God, I can in fact just be myself and my life will function. And it releases all the energy that's pent up trying to sustain a persona that's false, becomes available to them again. And all of a sudden their effectiveness in their life, their effectiveness in the sense of being who they are, increases 10, 20, 100-fold. Right? So you do that. You lead somebody into that experience and they have this tremendous sense of themselves. And the first time, it's overwhelming. They're literally in this state of exaltation where it's, if life could be like this, if this was it, Joseph, if I could just stay like this, then we'd be done. I'd had everything I want from you. And I go, absolutely, you're absolutely correct. That's the truth. However, for most people, that conditioned process of wearing the mask living inside and out from the persona that they've learned to wear for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, whatever number of years, is so habituated that when that stimulus shows up again, where they've learned that that keeps them safe and secure, the persona shows up and they're inside of it and they don't know how to get it off. It's like, your clothes have been glued to you and you're trying to get them off at night and they don't quite come off so easily. Well, that's how it is for most people wearing the mask or living from a persona. So we have to refine it. So the first time is the entry point. They have the experience of it. And then we go back again and we revisit it, and we revisit it with some obstacles and complications. What about like this? What about like that? What about when it's like this other way, or this is happening? Or what about when you recognize you didn't quite do it the way you wanted to? How do you get back to doing it the way you do want to? Right? And the more and more and more refined it comes, it's like the less and less and less tinfoil you need to wear. All of a sudden,
Okay.
you're able to resist all of that alien invasion without any tinfoil at all, just by being yourself.
I see.
Okay? So this is kind of the process. And that led to a second model. And the second model that I became aware that I was using, it wasn't like I actually built the model. I just kind of codified and defined it. And that was this model I call Soma-Semantics, or Soma-Semantic Modeling. And Soma-Semantics is really the process of the way we are in our body, our embodied state of being, the way we experience ourselves at a physical, visceral level, is integrated with the abstractions of thought and the representations we make in our mind. And these two things become singular. They become as though they're one thing. And there's no distinction or differentiation between the internal experience and the external experience. So when I perceive something in the world through my sensory intake systems, my eyes, my ears, my skin, whatever it may be, and my sense of that are highly aligned, those two things feel very, very congruent, then there's no differentiation between my internal and external experience. And Soma-Semantic Modeling begins from the idea of noticing how a person is responding in their body as they're expressing the representations in language of what they're experiencing.
Hence the two words
So real
soma
simply,
for
somebody goes,
the body and semantic for linguistics
right.
language.
So somebody goes, I'm really happy. And they make this gesture. Well, the truth is, for most people, these gestures are not random. They're linked to the neurological condition of the phrasing of being happy and that unique experience of happy. Now, they may say on another day, I'm really happy. Well, it's not the same as I'm really happy. Those are two different things. There's tonal shift, there's intensity shift, there's context shift. But in that moment that a person expresses whatever they're expressing, what they're doing with their body is a representation of what they're doing with their mind. And that's what Soma-Semantics is really looking for, is the ability to overlay and overlap the semantic representation, how they represent to themselves what they're thinking, and the physical response to that representation. It's kind of a convoluted loop because one generates the other in an infinite loop. So it's you feel something, so you think something, so you feel something, so you think something, or you think something, so you feel something, so you think something, so you feel something. And it doesn't really matter which comes first, the chicken or the egg. In the end, you have chickens laying eggs from which chickens hatch, right?
Mm-hmm. So this infinite loop that you speak of sounds like the original chicken and the egg, the original Catch-22. Is that the case?
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't matter which came first or comes first. Both are always present. Once the model is present, the entirety of the model is present, and that body-mind integration is present, and therefore we don't know necessarily which is leading at any given moment because they both feed into each other and are so integrated. For all intent and purpose, for the individual we're pointing to, it's simultaneous.
Right. And in our last interview, you spoke of it being simultaneous and hierarchical. Is that true?
Yes.
How so?
The simultaneity of experience is that basis for everything that I'm doing, you could say, because the idea of separation is incredibly illusionary. We think that we experience things in sequences. And even when I'm working with someone, I treat it as though they're experiencing things in sequences. So I make believe, because it's useful, to go, the first thing that happens is you have a sensory experience. And that perception leads to sense making, which leads to meaning making, which leads to decision making, which leads to action. The reality is, as soon as you see something, your body is responding and preparing you. It's creating the conditions for action to happen from the instant you see it. Before you made sense of it, before you make meaning of it, before you make decisions that are in any way conscious. There are parts of the neurological processing system which are acting as though all of that's already done before you have any awareness you've done any of it. Okay? So by the time I recognize I've seen an apple tree and I'm in a physiological state of hunger, I'm already producing saliva. Mm-hmm. So this simultaneity of body and mind and body, is always present in the same way that the simultaneity of intake and output is always present. As we're taking information in, we're literally generating outputs, which is why sometimes I tell people who I'm training to do the kind of work that I do, that if they've waited for the person to answer the question they've asked, they've missed the answer. Because the answer is happening as they're asking the question. And it's represented in what they're doing in their body. And knowing how to and what signals to pay attention to is really the key to being effective at the level of work that I'm doing. Mm-hmm. So maybe I'll give you an example. It might be easier. And that is, the other day I'm working with someone and I'm speaking with them on the phone. And as I'm speaking with them, they made a gesture. And the gesture they made was that they were going to move forward. And they didn't know they made the gesture. They were unaware that they did this. And when I pointed it out, they didn't even know they'd done it after the fact. So once I even pointed it out to them, they weren't aware they did it. But before I pointed it out, I was already talking to them about moving forward. I was already speaking to them, although they had not used that phrasing, about the idea that what they were doing was connected to and related to the idea of moving forward. And it made perfect sense to them. They go, yeah, of course, that's exactly what it's like. Well, it seems like I made that up, but I didn't make it up. When somebody says, it's really important for me to succeed, and they do this, and I go, so like kind of moving forward, right? Making things happen, like getting something to happen because you intended it to at some point in the future. And they go, yeah, exactly like that.
So you
but
put
this gesture
linguistic
contains all of that
semantics
information.
to the physical gesture or the somatic.
So that's the basis of what I'm calling Soma-Semantics, is being able to notice for that kind of information. Now, somebody who's highly, highly trained can do that at what we call the micromuscular level. We're kind of noticing the tiny little muscles in their body twitch as they're thinking about doing what they do. Right? Again, it's always easier, I think, for most people if I give examples, especially to this esoteric stuff. Mm-hmm. And you know, there's a guy that you and I have talked about. You're aware of him at least through our conversations, if not otherwise. And this guy's name is Paul Ekman, the guy who was the basis for this TV show Lie to Me. And Paul did years and years and years of research on what he called micro expressions, things that flash for as little as a 15th of a second across someone's face. So tiny little muscular gestures of these 100+ muscles of your face that contort your expression and are connected, according to Paul's research, to specific emotional responses. Disgust, contempt, surprise, fear, joy, all these different emotional responses that he's mapped. And literally he's giving these muscles, you know, specific indicators, E7. So when E7 and G14 are contracted simultaneously, that indicates, and he gives the emotional response at a 15-second interval. And people that work with him are trained to notice that in as little as a 15-second of that moving across someone's expression. And when he slows down high-speed cameras to show you what's happening as a person is being asked a question, you can see these expressions now flickering across their face because he freezes them and goes, see that there? That's E7 and G14. And that means the person had contempt for the person asking the question because, and you know, he lays out the structure. Well, these are the same things we're looking for, is those tiny little body movements. So for instance, if you'll pay attention to my right shoulder, this is my right shoulder, right? So everybody knows which one is my right shoulder. Is if somebody goes like that, and it's that little movement, well, that's noticeable. And if you know what you're looking for, you can see that happening. And if that happens once, it doesn't mean anything. It might mean there was a butterfly landing on their shoulder and they didn't like the weight of it. If it happens twice in response to the same contextual marker, I ask the same kind of question, I reference the same content, I do the same thing with my body, and they do this, well, I know now I have possibly the beginning of a pattern. I test that again, and it happens a third time, I have a pattern. Nobody does this randomly 3 times in a row to the same context, to the same stimulus, and have it be meaningless. So sometimes, you know, as Freud said, a cigar is just a cigar. But other times it means a whole lot more. Well, the same thing is true of these tiny little muscular movements. And for somebody who's trained at the level that I'm training people, this movement is exaggerated. For us, this kind of movement looks like this to most people. That's what we're talking about for Soma-Semantics.
Okay, so far we have the MythoSelf model, which I believe is also tied to Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, and we can go back and reference that later. Then we have your Soma-Semantic Model, which has to do with an embodied state of being, and the abstraction of mind, where language and linguistics tie to the body.
So the first model, as I said, by the way, was originally called the Mythogenic Self Model. And the reason I call it the Mythogenic Self Model, mythogenic means myth-making. And that came out of this early work I did with the study of Joseph Campbell's work on mythological form. So Joe Campbell's Hero's Journey, it still remains a big part of what I do and how I think about working with people, and the way that Joseph Campbell spoke about the functions of myth, the way that Joseph Campbell talked about discovering one's myth and living out of one's myth and what mythic form is, all things I think we've spoken about pretty intensely and pretty conclusively, you could even say, in some of the earlier conversations we've had. But that was the basis of this model that transformed just as a label from the Mythogenic Self Model into the MythoSelf Model. And because it's a process of working with people, getting them, as we said, from the initial contact and into their state of perfection, and then stabilizing that, the real name for that model is the MythoSelf Process. And that's really this first umbrella model. It's the thing that contains almost everything else, this MythoSelf Model, the understanding that in the MythoSelf Process, what I'm going to do is lead somebody into this state of perfection, which contains all this other incredible information. And Soma-Semantic modeling, or Soma-Semantics, is a process that I use to pay attention to and to create feedback for them to have this experience of the state of perfection. So it's kind of a model within a model that the people who are using the MythoSelf process access to be able to create the kind of effect that they want with the person they're trying to help and to intervene with, right? Well, as we develop that further, this MythoSelf model began to give rise to the idea of the autobiographical narrative. And the autobiographical narrative is this kind of Russian doll effect of stories. So there's this story that I tell myself about myself. Like, I know myself to be Joseph because, and I was like this when I was 3, and then that happened when I was 17, and then I had this other relationship at 22, and then of course this happened at 34, and so on and so forth. So this is the internal story about who I am. And it's not just historical or chronological, it's a sense of knowing myself to be a certain way. When this kind of thing happens, I'm going to respond like this. My favorite food is this other thing. I really like women who look this way. I'm attracted to men who speak in this manner, whatever it may be, right? So all these different ways of knowing myself. That's my story. You're never going to hear that. I'm never going to share that. I'm never going to put it out there because, number one, it's incredibly complex and would take a lifetime for you to hear. And number two, some of the aspects of that story may be so intimate, I don't want anybody to have access to them. In fact, the whole purpose of doing the MythoSelf process is to help a person recover what you could say they put into hiding because it was so sensitive that when they exposed it to the world, it got stepped on. And a person's not going to do that again. So that story, at least part of it, is going to remain private and internal.
Okay.
The other aspect of why it will never be told completely is some of it is just experienced by me non-verbally. It's out of language. I have a sense of being in the world that transcends any ability to describe what that sense is like. The second story I tell is the one I tell you. And the story I tell you is what you could say I want you to know about me. I'm incredibly handsome. I'm charming as hell. I'm brilliant, right? I'm probably going to be the funniest person you're ever going to meet. You're going to have such a good time hanging out with me. All the things I want you to know about me, I'm going to tell you. You know, I did this amazing work in my doctoral program. I'm a genius in this area of mythogenic work and whatever, you know, the story I tell. And that's pretty consistent for most people. They tell a pretty consistent story. So they're known to the world to some extent by the story they tell about themselves because it's also what they expose about themselves. A person who's got a very consistent autobiographical narrative that they share has a consistent behavioral pattern that to a great extent matches that autobiographical narrative, except it doesn't match it perfectly because it's not really who they are. So the third story is a sharing, if you will, of the stories you tell about me and then the stories I tell myself about what you tell about me. And there could be a kind of addendum to that, you can say, where there's stories I tell others about what you would tell about me. So it could be, well, if you asked Alicia about me, she would tell you that he's incredibly handsome, he's brilliant, a real genius on the face of the earth, and everybody should spend time with him, right? That would be a story that I might tell about you telling about me. And so these are the three stories. They're stacked, and collectively they form the autobiographical narrative. The stories I tell myself about myself, the stories I tell you about me, and the stories you tell about me that I then make part of the story that I tell about me.
Okay.
Now, the more consistent those things are, you could say the better, the higher quality of the experience of the individual who tells the story will be. So if I know myself to be A, and the story I tell you is a very, very close adaptation or representation of A, and therefore when you experience what I do and the behaviors that are expressed by me, and you know me as being, you tell me back a story about me that sounds a lot to me like A, there's very little friction in the system. I have to use very little energy now to make sense of those stories and to maintain that consistency. That's the advantage of the MythoSelf process, is that it leads you to arriving at an autobiographical narrative which is what we can call much closer to truth or reality for the individual, even if it's subjective, even if it's not true in the sense of a scientist studying us and observing us with a video camera and analyzing the videos they make 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 5 years, longitudinally, blah, 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 blah. But for us as an internal representation, what we believe to be true about ourselves, what we share with others about ourselves, and what we hear back from others sharing about us are very much aligned. It creates this incredible representation of ease for us to move through the world. There's very little friction, very little energy that is required to sustain that. Right?
So the reframe
And of course,
or the rehabilitation of one's autobiographical narrative is part and parcel of the mythogenic process?
the mythogenic process, that MythoSelf process, leads us to the ability to become aware of the distinctions of the autobiographical narrative. So we can begin to go, oh, yeah, you're right. I do tell myself that, don't I? I do think of myself in that way. I am experiencing myself like that in my body. And yeah, I do move like that. And I do make those gestures. And yeah, you're right. They do represent to me this way of feeling. And then they go, oh, wow. And of course, if I'm telling you that I'm not interested, but my body is expressing that I'm very interested, wow, you pick up on that, don't you? So it's better for me just to be, straightforward and let you know I'm interested or I'm not interested, as the case may be. And then there'll be congruency between what I'm doing inside and what I'm doing outside. Now we begin to be internally and externally congruent, and there's great alignment there. And of course, if I'm like that, then your experience of me is very congruent. And what I seem to represent and present to you matches how you experience me. And over time, that consistently leads you to believe that you know me. And in fact, I think you know me, because when you talk to me or about me, especially when you talk about me, I recognize what you're saying as the way I think about myself. Right? So that's what we're trying to achieve in the long view of the MythoSelf process, is that a person has an integrated autobiographical form that's represented in language, but also represented non-verbally in their behaviors. And the way they think about themselves and the world and other people obviously fit into that, because it's an integrated, aligned, congruent way of being in the world. So now we've transcended, the idea of the separation of behavior and being. They literally are the same thing.
Okay, great. And the reason I used the word rehabilitate earlier is the first thing that comes to mind is the limiting beliefs and sort of the negative autobiographical narrative that we may hold that then forms, it moves through all the layers, so then we behave certain ways and carry our body certain ways and move out into life and seem to generate more of the same. So is there a process then of unwinding those limiting beliefs and the negative autobiographical narrative when people work with you?
Well, one of the questions we'd have to ask is, where are those beliefs coming from? What is it that you're actually experiencing, right?
Right. And I was also thinking that ties back to trauma as well.
Right. So when we begin to go into this question, where is that belief coming from? And we begin to understand that there's this deep belief that you hold that limits you. That's where I'm going to kind of make the argument that we're dealing with a trauma. So there's an old trauma that's in place, that you've experienced yourself in some traumatic way. And because of that, what's going on is that you are limiting yourself because that trauma's unresolved. You're still dealing with it as though it's happening in a context that is different from the context where it was created or established. That will always create hesitation, procrastination, the inability to access yourself in a resourceful way. So that's what I would say, is that you begin to understand and you can express yourself with great fluidity when you have congruency. And therefore, the limiting beliefs, they're not present when you're like that. And I have now begun more and more and more to operate from the premise that limiting beliefs are actually responses to old traumas that the person does not know they're there. They don't experience themselves as responding to trauma, but what they're doing is they're expressing the way they've learned to compensate for those sensitizing imprints, the way they've learned to compensate for engaging the world and having the world not conform to their expectation or desire. Does that make sense?
It does.
Right. So, little kids, my granddaughter now is going to be a year old in August, and she's unabashedly charming. Not because she's my granddaughter, but because she's under a year old and doesn't know any better. So she does whatever she wants to do, literally. If it's throw the spaghetti out of the plate and across the room, she does it. Now, the way the world responds to her is a different thing. So some parents, some people around her, some adults, maybe either some other children, would find that, let's call it, offensive, right? The family dog finds it delightful. So depending on the response she's getting and what she's paying attention to and how overwhelming the input is, it'll create different kinds of imprints. So if what happens is the family dog is the one that's creating the imprint, she thinks throwing spaghetti out of her plate across the room is the most wonderful, delightful thing to be doing, and she's giggling and laughing as she does it. If, on the other hand, somebody in the room goes, "Oh my God, what are you doing? Don't do that. Don't play with your food." Well, she's 9 months old or 10 months old. That's traumatizing. That tone of voice. It doesn't matter that she understands or doesn't understand the words. The attitude behind it is expressed energetically, literally, into her experience. It influences her sphere of being. And now she's got to accommodate that. Well, it happens once, maybe it's no big deal. But it's likely if she's had that experience once, it's going to repeat because the person in that environment is the person who generates that experience. And now she learns to control herself. It's no longer fun to have food in front of you, which has this wonderful red color, and you can spread it all over the table, and you can rub it on your face and in your arms, and they change color, and how wonderful that must be, right? But now it's been interrupted.
And so
So
she's getting
later
her
in life,
sensitizing imprints.
right? And that's going to show up. That's going to show up as that trauma experience that she doesn't know. She doesn't know why she feels uncomfortable putting makeup on. She doesn't know why she feels uncomfortable being in an environment with other people who are eating dinner. She doesn't know why she doesn't like to go out to dinner with people in public spaces. I'm not saying this happens, but any of these things could happen, and the person perceives it as being an issue they have. The reality is, it was an issue somebody else had with them that they then incorporated as their issue. And they went, okay, the way not to have this feeling is don't do those things in public. So I have a belief not only that I shouldn't do those things, but that I can't do those things. And then I meet people who are 30 years old and they go, listen, I got this new job. I love the work. I love where I'm working. I love the people I work with. But I have to speak and do this presentation in front of like the whole company. And I don't like speaking in front of people. In fact, I'm terrified even just thinking about it. Again, what 8-month-old is terrified about being themselves in a crowd of people? You know, if they're in their mother's arms, no child. Most of them, if they're on the ground and the world is interesting and attractive, they're just going for it. By the time they're 1.5, they've learned to be more cautious. By 5, they're halfway shut down. By 10, they can't speak in public.
This is where time travel comes in. I imagine that when you are working with that person later in life, you basically need to do the time traveling back to the point of the sensitizing and the trauma.
Let's be real clear. They're time traveling back, not me. So I'm having an experience with them sitting in my office, so to speak, about their need to speak publicly in front of an audience. And they're time traveling back to when they were 4 and they got up to say something at a family party and got shot down and felt stupid and embarrassed. So what I do is I'm time sliding with them. So I'm beginning to take resources from the future where they've excelled in front of an audience. And I take them back to when they were 4. And I make it clear to them, was it possible for you to have this level of performance at 4 years old when you didn't know any better? And they go, of course not. And I go, well, what if you did? And they go, oh my God, that would have been incredible. Uncle Jim would have felt so stupid saying stuff to me. I would have known just what to say to him. And you go, right. And then how about now, as you think about yourself here, knowing that that's what it's going to be like in the future when we finish what we're doing together, and you'll never feel like you did when you were 4 years old with Uncle Jim, but instead you'll feel like you were 4 years old with Uncle Jim when you made him feel stupid.
So you actually take a knowing and an empowerment from their future self,
Correct.
or their present self, back to their past self to heal and empower their past self, rather than retracing and revisiting the original trauma as it was, per se. You're literally, you're doing this time sliding with a therapeutic benefit to them.
Yeah. What I do is I take their sense of time and I create an oil slick. so they can move through it anywhere they want to go, where it's the most useful. So the biggest resources that are available to them then. Like I might even say to that person, so remember when you were 4 and Uncle Jim made you feel stupid because you said something and everybody was talking about dogs and you pointed to the family cat and he pointed it out and made you stand out in a really foolish way? So do you remember when you were 2 and you were dancing on the table and everybody thought you were the most charming kid in the world? That was different, right? So you may even take them further back, where there were resources from an earlier time that you then begin to update into a future time, right? So there's all kinds of ways to do it.
Mm-hmm. So they're the ones time traveling, time sliding, but you're the one providing the resource and providing the oil.
Right. I'm creating their ability to slide into and out of time to wherever it's most useful for them to be, to have accesses to the resources that are most beneficial to have available to them in the moment they need them.
Okay, great. So what more can we say about this topic of autobiographical narrative? Because it seems, it seems so foundational. I remember in a previous conversation that we had, you said that it's linguistics that are like the pod that Neo's in. It's linguistics, and I would correlate that with the stories we tell, our autobiographical narrative. All of that is what binds us and keeps us limited as who we think we are rather than perhaps who we really are.
Yeah, I think probably what I said, because I think of it this way, is language. That language is literally the matrix, and that we're swimming in this sea of language. Words and phrases and sentences and stories are all comprised of language. And at its very best, if language is brilliant, it's one step removed from reality. The only time that language is not at least one step removed from reality is when language stops trying to be connected to reality, is when it's poetic as opposed to prosaic. So all of a sudden, these people can speak in poetic terms, you know. The frog lightly dances on the starlight. It's like, of course that makes no sense. But when someone experiences that idea, the frog dances lightly on the starlight before it splashes into the pond. It changes the image of the frog jumped into the pond and made a splash. Right? There's this sense that for a moment, in mid-flight, the frog is suspended and is now, instead of just moving over the normal, process of physics because of the force generated by its legs for the jump and blah, 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 which is not that it's not interesting or useful to know that. It may be. But the representation in the mind of the person who hears the frog jumped and for a moment danced lightly on the starlight before it splashed into the pond creates a different mental representation. That poetic form of language now, it's no longer trying to be connected to reality in a literal sense. It's suggesting a representation which transcends language. So other than language like that, language is always at least one step removed from reality. The frog jumped and splashed into the pond is not a representation of what actually happened. It leaves out everything that occurred before. Why did the frog jump? How high did the frog jump? Did the frog jump to the edge of the pond or the middle of the pond? Was it a big splash or a small splash? All that information isn't present, but yet we presume that in this statement we've heard, we understand what happened. It's at least one step removed from reality. Sometimes it's 2, 3, 4 steps removed from reality because of a lot of errors in communication, including errors of perception.
Is that what the meta model of NLP addresses?
The meta model of NLP attempts to clarify some of those distortions and generalizations and deletions that happen in language, absolutely, and gives you linguistic form to do that. But it still doesn't get you to what is beneath the form. It doesn't take you to the actual deep structure which is the embodiment of the experience. So you know that if you were at the pond when the frog did something, whatever that frog actually did, your experience of it would be more than descriptive. It would be physical. You would have an experience of what was happening in front of you. The fear, the delight, the excitement, the avoidance, the attraction, whatever it may have been, was viscerally organized, not just conceptually organized. Language assumes the world is conceptual, that we're brains floating around in a sea of language.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, let me just phrase back to you some things and to see what I got from what you said. So language is inherently one step removed from reality when it is what I would say attempting to describe something logically or statically. And when it's more in a process or maybe dream mind mode, more poetic, that's when it may better reflect, be closer to the reality of embodiment and sensorial experience, and therefore would be more accurate. Is that correct?
Yeah, and to some extent, because poetic language also can exceed the linearity of ordinary language, let's call it, in the sense that ordinary language is always linear. So here I am talking to you, and there are fish on the side of me in my fish tank swimming, and the clock on the microwave far away from me is ticking, and there's my cat sitting on and it sounds like those things are happening in sequence. There's you and me talking, then there's the fish, then there's the microwave, then there's the cat, and they go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, step by step by step by step. I can't say them all at the same time, even though you have an idea that what I'm describing is all happening literally at the same time. So if nothing else, the limits of language are in fact connected to its linearity. Words come one after another. It's the nature of language.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And how does this tie to the autobiographical narrative?
That there is no getting away from being human and having language. There's no getting away from the way that our brains, at least part of our brains, you could say, sequence information and create linear digital representations. It's just something humans do. Okay? Even if it's incredibly primitive. Right? So if I take a young child who has no conception of mathematics, and I put one marshmallow in front of them, and I put 3 marshmallows in another place in front of them, and I go, what do you see? And they go, marshmallow. And I go, which one is more? They can always point to the 3. If I go, what is that? And I point to the 1, and then I point to the 3, they may say, without me prompting anything other, when I point to the 3, more. So there's an immediate recognition of these distinctions of quantity, of sequence. It's just how our brains are built. So because of that, language suits us very well because it organizes the world in a linear, digital, sequential way. Words follow one after another in sequences. And those sequences in linguistics are called syntaxed. And syntax indicates meaning. So the dog bit the boy is a different meaning than the boy bit the dog, even though it's the same words. So the sequence of the words, to some extent, indicate the meaning of the words. And we're organized to understand language like this. Right? A poem might go, dog and boy biting happens.
Mm-hmm. And there are process languages that actually are structured that way. The Indian languages in particular, Sanskrit, and I know that Gujarati also, the structure of the language is that exactly.
Okay, I don't care what language you speak. I don't care if it's, Sanskrit or High German or English or, one of the dialects of the Amazon, whatever language it is, the expression of the sounds that create that language have to come out one after another. The sounds have sequence.
Okay, so the use of the language itself creates a sequence, which then brings in this effect of the linear sort of binding force of the language.
There's going to be linearity in language. Mm-hmm. It's just the way it is, right? Because I can't make all the sounds of a sentence at 1 second, one time. I can't do it.
And is it the linearity that begins to bind?
The linearity divorces you from reality, because reality doesn't happen in a linear way. Reality happens in a way that is simultaneous, not sequenced.
Mm-hmm.
The kid ran into the street, the car was coming, the mother saw him, the policeman grabbed him. All happened at one moment. All of that happened like that.
It's multidimensional.
But I can't say that. So I have to try to construct language which lets you know it's all happening at the same moment. And despite that, when I make these words come out, the representations in your mind are happening in a sequence. Even if I tell you to put it all together and it was all happening at once, in order to do that, you still have to hear a sequence of sounds that gave you this information. So the representations in your mind come up one at a time as you're getting them, as they're being offered in language. Right? Now, there are people, of course, we know use language beautifully. They're linguistic artists. Some novelists have done amazing things with language. Some, people who are erudite speakers and orators can make language really wonderfully poetic and beautiful. And even these people who are the best at it in the world or in the history of humankind still can't help but have language be sequential.
Mm-hmm. So then what now?
So I'm going to go back to your earlier question, which is, what has this got to do with the autobiographical narrative? Our narratives are also sequential. And we tell the stories to ourselves in many ways using language. But I'm going to suggest that language both simultaneously emerges from and points to the embodied experience of the individual. Right? So I could do something very simple. And I could say to you, and play along with me here, and so you'll get what I'm doing. When we started the call today, you saw me wearing the shirt I'm wearing. Right?
Right.
So when you saw me wearing the shirt I'm wearing, and you saw that I'm wearing this Florida tan, what did you think?
I thought that you were particularly red today as compared to other days.
Okay. And what did you feel?
I wondered, what did I feel? I found it slightly humorous.
And my guess is that seeing that and feeling that led you to the experience you're going to have of whatever came next.
Yeah, well, and what came next was a thought that I wondered if actually you were sunburned and if it was uncomfortable for you.
Right. So all of that happened at one time. And the reality of it is that sensation you had that was present while those thoughts were happening, and those thoughts you had while that sensation was present, were so intertwined, so integrated, that they were one thing for you. They weren't two things. But we can't talk about them as though they're one thing, because we don't have language that allows us to simultaneously speak about more than one thing at a time. Right? So the best I can do is begin to build these stories with you, which are integrated in such a way that the language we're using is organized with at least enough of a degree of poetic structure, what we can call metaphor, that you recognize that what you're doing is telling a story and not the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, which gives you a lot of leeway and room to be creative about how you identify and build the representation of yourself. And through time, if you and I are doing really good work together, and you're learning this model that I'm operating from, this Mythogenic Self Model, what you're going to learn is that all of those descriptions, that autobiographical narrative, is really there for you to be able to have an experience of yourself, which is outside of language.
What comes to mind, Joseph, is the artist formerly known as Prince.
Exactly. Right. He made a great example for us by becoming a symbol. Right. He was making a profound statement in that choice of identity. Because at that point, he had a label which was indescribable, literally. And therefore, he could no longer be labeled in an ordinary way. He had entered into that poetic space.
He was a linguistic activist.
The thing probably that I want to make sure we kind of step into before we move out of this space today is that there was another, evolution. And as the evolution of what I'm talking about continued, I began to become aware of this way that thinking, the active process of conscious awareness, influences so much of the experience of an individual, who they know themselves to be, what it is they experience the world as being in relation to them, the sense of their relationships with other people, their desires about the future, their recollections about the past, are all held in these conscious forms that we can call cognition, thinking, right? Mm-hmm. And what I found is that the people who seem to have the most satisfying lives, the people who enjoy the quality of their life the most, the people who can accomplish the most along the lines of the intentions they have and the desires they wish to experience and express, the people who have the greatest ability to move in environments that don't always agree with them, right? The universe doesn't always wake up in the morning on the same side of the bed as they do. This adaptability of the way that they think, cognitive adaptability, is an incredibly profound skill set to develop. So I began developing a model as I worked with clients that I referred to as adaptive cognitive training, ACT, ACT. And the reason I used that was to be very clever, and I wanted the initials to describe what it is I'm going to do and how I'm going to work with someone to help them be adaptive cognitively. So I'm going to do adaptive cognitive training. But the intention of it always was to lead to the ability to take action that generated the results they want. So ACT, ACT. And adaptive cognitive training has been where I put a lot of my attention and energy in the last few years of refining and developing, both in terms of being able to work with clients and to help them get what they want, but in defining a model of how to do this, how to generate an adaptive cognitive state, an adaptive cognitive way of being in the world and performing. And literally what it means is a loosening, if you will, of the beliefs and values you hold as absolute. In other words, what I found is that the people who seem to generate the most ability in the most varied context and to be able to keep up with the world we actually live in today, which is incredibly complex and seemingly constantly in flux. It's changing rapidly, maybe more rapidly than ever in the history of humankind in terms of the experience of people living at least in the first world. So the influx, the inputs of communication, the amount of information that's available, the exposure to that information, the various sources of information coming at us, the various kinds of people we come into contact with, because we live in a multicultural space. We're no longer living in a space that's occupied by people who are all like us, with all of the same beliefs coming from all of the same background. We live in a space where we encounter people from all kinds of backgrounds with various beliefs, ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, racial backgrounds, sexual differences of preferences, all kinds of different things on almost a daily basis in the first world in a modern lifestyle. This is unprecedented. Never in the history of humankind have people ever been exposed to this variety at this rate of absorption, the numbers of encounters with this variety being present. And therefore, the ability to be adaptive to that kind of complexity and the consistency of change for most people is experienced at some level as chaotic. It's overwhelming. But those people who seem to have the greatest range of flexibility, being able to absorb and encounter people and accept the beliefs and values they bring to the conversations, to allow their beliefs and values to be loose enough to have room in them to incorporate the values and beliefs of others, and to change their values and beliefs as they learn different things about the world. They seem to have the greatest ability to function and lowest levels of stress, lowest levels of anxiety, greatest ability to transcend early traumas, greatest ability to create performances on their own and with others that create the outcomes and results they want. And so adaptive cognitive training is really a focus on the way that people hold their beliefs and values and the way they can learn to hold them loosely enough to perform elegantly in a multitude of contexts in relation to a multitude of people, but not so loosely they have no sense of themselves in their own center. And that balancing act between the consistency of belief and values that keep me knowing who I am and the looseness of beliefs and values that allow me to experience the world and remain open to others is really the outcome of adaptive cognitive training.
And so we've looked at 3 distinct models that you work within, I assume simultaneously and hierarchically. And so where does this adaptive cognitive training fit with the mythogenic and the Soma-Somatic?
There's a deep belief, I hate to use that word right now, but a deep presumption is probably a better word, within the MythoSelf Process model that this autobiographical piece is central to the experience of ourselves in the world and our ability to create outcomes in the world, to accomplish things, to do things, to perform. And that goes through a sub-model again, models within models within models, maps within maps within maps, called the ladder of perception, which is how I define how people experience the world cognitively. It's an integral part of adaptive cognitive training. And it means they experience sensory information. My voice right now for you is a sensory input, right? Your ability to hear what I say is organically organized. Your literal ability to hear the words and to make sense of them is a perceptual experience. And then from that, to make sense of what I'm saying. What are those words put together? The sentence Joseph just said is this. And then the meaning of that sentence. So you can hear me say, you're wearing a hat today. And that makes sense. You go, oh, he's referring to this thing I have on my head that is headwear of some kind, that he's calling a hat, and that it's on me. That's sense making. There's no meaning to it yet. And you go, he must think, and now you're going to apply meaning, that wearing a hat is unusual, or wearing a hat is normal, or wearing a hat makes me look good, or wearing a hat makes me look bad, or that maybe I shouldn't be wearing a hat, or he loves that I'm wearing a hat. So you add meaning to it. And the meaning is self-generated. It's only peripherally tied to the actual sense-making of what it is I said. You bring meaning to the sense. You get that? The words themselves have no meaning beyond descriptive until you add meaning to them. That becomes subjective. Okay? A tree in the forest has no meaning other than a tree in the forest. But you bring meaning to it that's a source of firewood. That's a source of shade. That's in my way, it's blocking my view. I want to cut it down. That's all meaning. Right? And then from there you get to sense making. I will or I won't cut it down. That's sense making. Decision making. That's decision making. So you've sensed that there's a tree in the woods. You make sense of it. There is a tree. You make meaning of it. It's in the way of my view. You make a decision. I will cut it down, which leads to action, cutting down the tree, which leads to another round of sensory data. There is no tree. My view is clear, but now I have no shade on this side of my house. So I'm going to replace the tree with a canopy. So I'm going to hang canvas from my roof to replace what the tree was doing for me naturally. But I now have a view I didn't have before. You get it? Loops and loops and loops as well. So this idea of what I'm doing is always related back to this autobiographical narrative. And this way of the stories we tell that give shape and meaning to ourselves, to the world about us, and to the experience we have with others, because we're shaping their experience of us as well, is always what I'm coming back to. So adaptive cognitive training is about helping you to manage the way that you experience the stories of others and your own story in relation to others and the world about you. Are trees good or bad things? Is it important to keep the tree there even though it's in the way of my view because it provides these other things? Is the view the most important thing, or is protecting the natural foliage on the land that I own the most important thing? Do I actually own this land, or am I just occupying it while I'm alive? These are beliefs and values. And the more that I can have multiple beliefs and values, the more, again, that I'm loose, that I've kind of loosened things up a bit. I've referred to this a little earlier as well. The more I have options and choices. And again, what I said was people who do this seem to have the greatest levels of satisfaction and happiness, ease and pleasure in their life, and are also the most able to produce outcomes and results on their own and with others. And that comes down to this ability to increasing the range of choices they have available and the way that those choices in context work for them. Because no choice is the right choice outside of context.
Are you saying, therefore, that you would like to see a world of loose men, women, and children?
Of course. Absolutely. Which is freeing them from the bondage we started with in our conversation today.
Great. And from here, what would you consider to be the important areas of discussion going forward?
So I think that it's always coming back around to the same things for me. And I continue to develop and learn more about the same things. So back in 1990, when I began this whole journey that I've been on, I probably actually began it because I was seeking to increase the range of my own choices, to feel like I had options and was free to act and move in the world without an encumbrance of my past. And so therefore I was seeking ways to do it. And again, Roy, in the mentoring of me, opened up that path for me greatly, and then installed and allowed me to develop some skills to be able to do this more effectively for myself and then with others. And then over the 30 years that I've been doing this, it continues to come back to the idea of having the freedom to act in the world, to act with what I call creative expression, to express ourselves with a great deal of creativity and freedom to produce the kinds of outcomes and results that we want on our own and with others. And developing these models that have allowed me to become more precise and more elegant in being able to do that, and especially in being able to do that with and for others. So most of my life's work has been in working with other people in a way that I provide interventions that free them from these past encumbrances, these limiting beliefs, the words you used, or the previous traumas and the sensitizing imprints. And once those things are kind of dispersed and they've been dismissed from the impact they've held in a person's life, more freedom arises. And they still need to have the refinement to know what to do with that freedom, right? We all know that. We talked about my little granddaughter, who's 9 or 10 months old now. I have to do the calculation. She's 10 months old. And she has great freedom. And she'll continue to have great freedom from a lot of these encumbrances that she will have or may have at 10 or 20. But she doesn't know what to do with it. She has no way to direct that attention as effectively as she might when she's 10 or 20. She won't be as self-determining. So Now as adults, what we want to do is we have that creative expression, that tremendous freedom of choice and options available to us, with an overlay of the ability to make good, high-quality decisions that create decisions that produce actions, that create the outcomes and results we want in the moment, but consequentially set up a pathway for what we also want to be true after the fact. A day from now, a month from now, a year from now, a decade from now, we're creating pathways that continue to create recursive loops of success and happiness and satisfaction. And again, because we live in a world that we are constantly rubbing shoulders with others in, for ourselves and with others, right? So that's the essence of where it is I think I go, and where we go in the conversation, is to look at how these models continue to evolve, how we continue to apply them, what other models might be available for us to look at and have conversations about that will provide specific and further identification of the kinds of distinctions that allow people to actually do this, to open their lives up to greater creative expression with more options and choices available to them, so they can create more of their desired results and outcomes on their own and with others.
And become more fully human.
Right. Yeah. And I think, it's in addition to being looser men and women, what we want to do is attain that kind of childlike access that, people like my granddaughter, because she's 10 months old, have, but without the childishness. So we don't want childish people. We want childlike people who are adults, people who can live in a poetic response to the world.
Great. Let us make that so. Dr. Joseph Riggio, thank you so much for joining me once again. I did bring my intergalactic tinfoil passport so that we could time travel today. And look what I've just found inside. A purple kiss for you.
There you go.
You have a collection of purple kisses from me, and I look forward to future conversations and future opportunities to purple kiss you once again.
I look forward to it. And today seemed to border on a conversation with Douglas Adams. So thank you. I simply leave you with this, 42.
Thank you. I will investigate.